The test of a first-rate intelligence is the ability to hold two opposed ideas in the mind at the same time and still retain the ability to function. Francis Scott Fitzgerald.
Spontaneous improvement.
We've all been taught since school that all living things evolve over time, progressing from simple forms to more complex ones. But let's take a closer look. What exactly is this complexification? And more importantly, what laws govern it? What's driving life to get more complicated in the first place? After the chapter, What is the Meaning of Life?, we now understand that the self-improvement of life is, in a broad sense, a continuous process of refining, expanding, deepening, and competitively selecting the model of the universe. This process is called cognition. But how does this happen? First, we need to clarify something. With very, very rare exceptions, individual life forms, species, don't really get more complex themselves. They simply go on reproducing within their ecological niche. But when one of these species happens to win the mutation lottery, it leads to the birth of a new life startup, a daughter evolutionary branch. This doesn't always result in the complete disappearance of the parent branch either. For example, chimpanzees and humans share a common ancestor. At some point, the chimpanzee branch split off, and then, very reluctantly, the human branch followed, or maybe it was the other way around, doesn't matter. Since those ancient paleontological times, the chimpanzee startup has staked out its business niche and hasn't really rethought its business model, its model of the universe. Meanwhile, the human startup developed a business model that allowed it to spread across the entire planet, take over or buy out hundreds of other startups, eliminate the most dangerous or stubborn competitors, and assume the position of the almighty monopolistic dictator of nature. The human startup continues to actively complicate its business model, while living beings with less adequate models of the universe effectively fertilize the soil, creating conditions for the further refinement, expansion, and deepening of the champion model. Now for the important part. I'm convinced that all these gradual refinements, expansions, and deepening of the models of the universe follow the laws of mathematical logic. So, what is logic? Intuitively, we think of logic as a special ability to reason, a certain rigor and coherence of thought that, in scientific discussions, sometimes helps avoid fistfights with your opponents. In such debates, after scratching our heads and begrudgingly putting away the figurative middle finger in our pocket, we declare,
"Well, what can I say? That's logical."
In doing so, we're essentially acknowledging that the formal structure of the reasoning, what we call logic, is inherently sound. In the natural world, the improvement of the model of the universe, evolution, happens through blind trial and error. To successfully deepen or expand a functioning model of the universe, many thousands of failed mutations must occur, with only one managing to pass the test of life and get locked in. But we humans have mastered a method thousands, if not millions, of times more efficient for expanding and deepening our model of the universe, cognition through logic, mathematics. Using this method, we successfully refine and expand our model of the universe simply by finding logical chains of cause and effect between its previous and next versions. In other words, what nature stumbles upon blindly, we achieve by applying the laws of mathematical logic.
Every step in successfully improving the model of the universe must follow the laws of mathematical logic.
If that's the case, we can easily formulate a concept of the simplest model of the universe, that is, the model that must have been adopted by the first, most primitive living being, and which all later generations and modifications of models of the universe have been building on and refining. The simplest possible operator in mathematical Boolean logic is the identity operator. This is an unary operator, meaning it only works with one operand, just itself. This basic operator allows anything to be checked for whether it is identical or not identical to itself. In other words, by executing this simplest logical action, any living thing, like a kitten in front of a mirror, can answer the question, is this thing me or not me? Clearly, no simpler model of the universe could exist than this. The universe is everything outside of me, everything that is not me. A more advanced model of the universe must already be capable of distinguishing between beneficial, good, and dangerous, bad entities or phenomena. That is, it needs to learn how to divide the universe into friends and foes. More on that in the next chapter. To do so, this more developed, we'll call it social, model of the universe will have to adapt more complex binary operators from mathematical logic, conjunction and disjunction. Something along the lines of,
Universe is everything that is not me.
and then,
Me and friend is good. Me and foe is bad.
then it goes further.
The friend of my friend is my friend. The enemy of my friend is my enemy. The friend of my enemy is my enemy. The enemy of my enemy is my friend.
Obviously, this cannot be final. For instance, the enemy of my enemy isn't always going to be your friend, so it forces life to constantly develop and refine this model, making it broader, deeper, and more nuanced by adopting increasingly complex statements from mathematical logic. However, the ability to distinguish between me and not me remains the foundational concept of any model of the universe. And this concept is undeniably inherited by all living beings. Now we've arrived at a crucial conclusion here. Every living being must at least understand what me is and be able to distinguish between me and not me. Let's call this fundamental property of life subjectivity.
Subjectivity is the ability of any living being to understand what me is and the ability to recognize the difference between me and not me.
Without the understanding of what is me, it is impossible to maintain one's internal state, homeostasis. After all, to do this, one must be able to distinguish between external events and internal events. External events are those that come from the universe, from not me, and may, for example, harm or even kill me, so it's crucial to react appropriately to them. Internal events, on the other hand, are of an entirely different nature. These need to be interpreted and understood to adjust, balance, and coordinate internal physiological processes to maintain homeostasis. And now we've reached a very interesting discovery. As soon as we define the property of subjectivity in life, we can now understand the mechanism behind its spontaneous improvement. In other words, we can answer the question, what constantly and relentlessly drives life towards self-improvement? The fact is, the division of the universe into me and not me creates an unsolvable logical problem that can be framed as follows.
Subjectively, the universe is not me. Objectively, me is part of the universe.
More than 500 years BC, the Greek philosopher Heraclitus developed a philosophical concept of change. You've probably heard, everything changes, where he introduced the idea of the unity of opposites. Over 2,000 years later, this idea was shamelessly borrowed by the German philosopher Georg Hegel and revolutionary journalist Friedrich Engels. According to the teachings of Heraclitus and Hegel-Engels, the driving force behind the development, evolution, of any system is the presence of what they called a dialectical contradiction within that system. And here we are, observing just such an internal contradiction between the subjective me and the objective universe.
As life learns about the universe, it becomes more complex, and in doing so, it makes the universe itself more complex. Because after all, life is a part of the universe. As a result, life is forced to cognize an increasingly complex universe, which, in turn, forces it to further complicate itself, and so on.
This leads us to a very fundamental conclusion.
Cognition is always accompanied by change, and change is always accompanied by cognition.
This conclusion, which we've reached at a philosophical level, will no doubt please physicists who are puzzled as to why, in the quantum world, the very act of observation, cognition, affects the outcome of that observation, leading to change. But more on that in part 3 of this book. Returning to the cognition and changes.
The inherent, irresolvable contradiction within life, between the subjective me and the objective universe, forces life to continuously cognize and change the universe.
This contradiction is like a carrot dangled in front of a foolish donkey. It relentlessly drives life in an enchanted circle. At every step of complication, at every level of hierarchy, life struggles to resolve the primary, fundamental contradiction of me versus the universe. These efforts are, by definition, doomed to failure. Yet life tries again, and each time the result is the same. These futile attempts strongly remind me of the never-ending renovations in my apartment. However, unlike that seemingly endless loop, this is not a cursed circle, but rather an upward spiral. Life's painful efforts are not in vain. Unbeknownst to itself, life is inevitably working its way toward a more and more adequate model of the universe.
Summary.
Every successful step in the improvement of the model of the universe must follow the laws of mathematical logic. Subjectivity is the ability of any living being to understand what me is and distinguish between me and not me. Cognition is always accompanied by change, and change is always accompanied by cognition. The inherent contradiction within life, between the subjective me and the objective universe, forces life to continuously cognize and change the universe.